Speak Amazon domain name equals news greater than the clock strikes midnight. January 17, 1920. A new era begins across the United States. Saloons lock their doors. Bartenders pour their last legal drinks. A profound silence falls over the nation's nightlife. This was the birth of Prohibition. It was called the Noble Experiment. A utopian dream to cure society's ills. To end poverty, crime, and disease by outlawing alcohol. But this is not the story you think you know. This is not a story about Al Capone. This is the story of the hidden truths. The secret loopholes. The shadow economies that erupted in the dark. It is the story of how a noble idea became a national disaster. And how an entire nation became a network of criminals. The 18th Amendment was law. The Volstead Act provided the means for its enforcement. The Anti-Saloon League celebrated its victory. They believed they had saved America's soul. But they had profoundly miscalculated. They did not understand the machine they had built. Or the people they sought to control. The federal government assigned just 1,500 agents to police the entire country. One agent for every 70,000 citizens. One agent for every 12 miles of coastline. It was an impossible task. A statistical fantasy. And the law itself was a masterpiece of unintended consequences. It was riddled with holes. Loopholes large enough to drive a truck through. A truck filled with whiskey. The first, and most significant, was medicinal. The Volstead Act made an exception for alcohol prescribed by a doctor. Suddenly, the nation developed a host of new ailments. Ailments only a dose of spirits could cure. Physicians became the new gatekeepers. Their prescription pads turned into printing presses for money. Pharmacies, once quiet dispensaries, saw lines stretching down the block. Walgreens, a small pharmacy chain, saw explosive growth. They expanded from 20 stores to nearly 400 during the 1920s. Their secret? They were one of the largest purveyors of medicinal whiskey. A doctor's quick signature was all it took. Ailments like nervousness, anxiety, or general malaise were common diagnoses. The prescription was always the same. A pint of whiskey, to be taken every few hours. The government had not outlawed drinking. It had simply outsourced it to the medical profession. Then there was the religious loophole. The law allowed for the production and consumption of sacramental wine. Almost overnight, America became extraordinarily devout. Applications to become priests and rabbis surged. Congregations swelled with new, thirsty members. Records show that wine inventories, held by religious leaders, mysteriously ballooned. Enough wine, in some cases, for every member to drink gallons per year. The experiment was not even a year old. And it was already a farce. The government was not fighting a war on alcohol. It was fighting a war against basic human nature. And it was losing. Badly. The foundation of the Noble Experiment was not solid stone. It was quicksand. As the 1920s roared on, the system began to rot from the inside. The problem was no longer just loopholes. It was a pandemic of corruption. The few prohibition agents, the proas, were underpaid. They were undertrained. And they were impossibly tempted. A bootlegger's bribe could be more than an agent's yearly salary. A turned head. A blind eye. That was the price of prosperity. Enforcement became a negotiation. Entire police departments were on the payroll of local liquor syndicates. From the patrolman on the beat to the captain in his office. Mayors and city officials looked the other way. They weren't just complicit. They were partners. In cities like Chicago, it was said that ordering a raid was the surest way to warn the speakeasy it was coming. The phone call from the police station often arrived before the police themselves. This was the untold story. Not of organized crime fighting the law. But of the law becoming organized crime. And while the powerful grew rich, a different revolution was happening in the homes of ordinary Americans. If you couldn't get a prescription, you simply made your own. Basements became breweries. Kitchens became distilleries. This was the era of bathtub gin. The name was literal. People used their bathtubs to mix and water down industrial-grade alcohol. The ingredients were cheap. The process was simple. The results were unpredictable. And often, deadly. Bootleggers would acquire industrial alcohol, legally produced for solvents and fuels. They would hire chemists to renature it. To remove the poisons added by manufacturers. But these chemists were often amateurs. Their methods, crude. A bad batch could contain methyl alcohol. A potent neurotoxin. It caused blindness. Paralysis. Death. The press called it poison liquor roulette. Thousands of Americans were killed. Not by gangsters' bullets. But by the drinks they made in their own homes. This was the social disaster hidden in plain sight. A public health crisis born from a moral crusade. Beyond the cities, a vast, hidden network thrived. This was not the world of mafiosos in pinstripe suits. This was the empire of the common man. Farmers with extra corn found a new cash crop, moonshine. They knew the backroads. Their stills were hidden deep in the hills and forests, untouchable by federal agents. On the coasts, fishermen became rum runners. Their territory was Rum Row, a floating line of ships from Europe and the Caribbean. They anchored just outside the U.S. maritime limit. At night, small, fast boats would dart out from shore. They would load up with crates of scotch, champagne, and rum. Then they would race back, dodging the Coast Guard in the dark. These were complex logistical operations, run not by crime families, but by communities. A whole town might be in on the secret. Their silence and cooperation fueled a multi-million-dollar illicit trade. The noble experiment had not stopped Americans from drinking. It had simply turned them into a nation of smugglers, chemists, and conspirators. By the late 1920s, the federal government grew desperate. Its strategy of enforcement had failed. Its own agents were corrupt. The public openly flaunted the law. So, the government made a final, horrifying decision. If they couldn't stop people from drinking industrial alcohol, they would make it more deadly. This was the government's own secret war. Federal officials ordered companies to add more potent poisons: kerosene, formaldehyde, acetone. Their logic was simple and brutal. They believed a few high-profile deaths would scare the population into compliance. It was a state-sanctioned poisoning program. The government was knowingly sickening and killing its own citizens to enforce a failing law. It is one of the darkest and least known chapters of the entire era. The ultimate perversion of the noble experiment. Then, the floor fell out. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. The economic argument against prohibition became undeniable. The government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars on enforcement. Yet it was collecting $0 in alcohol taxes. Money that could now be used for relief. For jobs. For bread lines. The hypocrisy was too much to bear. Powerful figures who had once championed the ban, like John D. Rockefeller Jr., publicly called for its repeal. He admitted the experiment had been a failure. It had increased lawlessness. It had fostered corruption. And it had cost the country a fortune. The tide had turned. The moral crusade was over. The nation needed jobs. And it needed a drink. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified. Prohibition was dead. Celebrations erupted nationwide. The saloons, now called taverns, reopened. The noble experiment had lasted 13 years, 10 months, and 19 days. It was meant to create a paradise. It created a shadow world instead. It failed to stop drinking. But it succeeded in other ways. It fostered the creation of powerful, national crime syndicates. It gave them a decade to build their empires, funded by illicit liquor. It normalized corruption in police forces for a generation. And it led to the expansion of federal power, creating agencies like the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, to fight the very crises it had created. The experiment ended. But its consequences never did. They are the hidden legacy. The faint, bitter aftertaste of a time when America went to war with itself. And lost. Less than /Amazon domain /speak.